If you grew up in a place like Clarksville, you know that the summers don't just feel hot, they feel heavy. Like the humidity is trying to keep a lid on things that should stay buried. I was 13 that year, 1998. I was at that awkward stage where the world felt too small, but the cornfields felt too big. My life was a predictable loop of cheap soda, bike rides until my shins were bruised and the constant low-level hum of my parents arguing behind closed doors. I was a quiet kid, observant, the kind who noticed when a neighbor painted their shutters a slightly different shade of green, or when the mailman started skipping our house on Tuesdays. My best friend, Leo, was the opposite. He was all noise and nervous energy. He lived 3 houses down, and that summer we were inseparable. We spent our afternoons at the old quarry, or sitting on the curb, talking about the lives we'd have once we finally got out of Indiana. My dad worked long hours at the plant, and my mom was always resting with the curtains drawn. That meant the house was usually ours. It started with the phone calls. Not the pizzas here calls, but the ones where the phone would ring. I'd pick it up, and there would be nothing but the sound of someone breathing. Heavy, rhythmic, and the faint, unmistakable sound of a car engine idling in the background. I didn't tell Leo at first. I didn't want to seem like a coward, but by the 3rd week of July, the calls weren't just coming to the house. I'd be at the park or the gas station, and I'd see a man. Just a man, standing by a payphone, watching me. He looked like anyone's father, clean-shaven, short hair, wearing a dull, gray windbreaker despite the 80-degree heat. He never approached me. He just existed in the periphery of my life. Then came the Tuesday my parents both had to stay late. The house was empty, the sun was setting, and the air was dead still. I remember Leo looking at me and saying, "Jax, I'm starving. Let's just order the usual and watch that horror movie your brother hid under the couch." I picked up the kitchen phone. I dialed the number for the local shop, but before I could even say hello, a voice on the other end spoke first. It wasn't the guy from the pizza place. It was the man in the gray windbreaker. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just said, "I'm right around the corner, Jax, and I brought something special. Just for you." 5 minutes later, the all-black sedan pulled into my driveway. No lights, no sound, and sitting on the roof of the car, like a sick joke, was a single matte black pizza box. Leo didn't hear the voice on the phone, so he didn't understand why I was standing in the kitchen, frozen, with the receiver still pressed to my ear. He was already headed for the front door, complaining about how he hoped they didn't skimp on the pepperoni this time. "Leo, wait," I croaked, but it was too late. He'd already swung the screen door open. The man was standing there on the porch. Up close, he was taller than he'd looked from across the street. His skin had a waxy, yellowish tint, and he was sweating. Great. Heavy beads of it rolling down his temples and soaking into the collar of that gray windbreaker. He wasn't holding the box like a delivery driver would. He held it with both hands, cradling it against his chest like it was a fragile, precious child. "Evening, boys," he said. His voice was thin, reedy, and he had this way of blinking one eye a split second slower than the other. It made his face look like it was vibrating. Leo stopped dead. He looked at the man, then at the all-black sedan idling in the driveway with no driver behind the wheel. We haven't even given you our address yet," Leo stammered, his voice dropping an octave. The man didn't answer him. He kept his eyes locked on mine. He walked past Leo, uninvited, and stepped into my foyer. The smell hit me immediately. It wasn't the smell of a kitchen. It was the sharp, stinging scent of formaldehyde and peppermint. He walked to the dining room table and set the black box down with a heavy, metallic thud. It wasn't cardboard. It was made of some kind of dense black polymer, and there were 4 heavy steel latches on the sides. Your father and I, we used to share everything, the man whispered, his eyes darting around the room as if he were looking for hidden cameras. But he's a greedy man, Jax. He kept the best parts for himself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of small, silver wire cutters. He didn't open the box. Instead, he reached down and snipped the phone line coming out of the wall. Snip. The dial tone died instantly. He looked at me, a terrifyingly vacant smile spreading across his thin lips. He tapped the top of the black box with the wire cutters. "I'm going to go get the drinks from the car," he said softly. "Whatever you do, don't open the 3rd latch until I get back. It's a surprise." He turned and walked back out the front door, leaving us alone in the house with that box. As soon as the screen door clicked shut, Leo grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "Jackson, look at the bottom of the box," he hissed. I leaned over the table. Dark, thick, crimson liquid was beginning to seep out from under the matte black seal, staining my mother's white lace tablecloth. And from inside the container, something started to scratch, a frantic fret clawing against the plastic. The scratching didn't sound like an animal. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like fingernails dragging across a chalkboard in a slow, agonizing crawl. Leo backed away, his face the color of wood ash. He was shaking so hard I could hear his sneakers squeaking on the linoleum.
"We have to go! Jax, we have to run out the back door, now!"
But I couldn't move. I was mesmerized by the liquid spreading across the table. It wasn't just pooling. It was thick, viscous, and it had that unmistakable, coppery tang that fills your nose when you get a bad nosebleed. I looked out the front window. The man in the gray windbreaker was standing by the open trunk of the sedan. He wasn't grabbing drinks. He was just standing there, staring at the house. His reflection distorted in the black paint of the car. He was holding something long and thin, wrapped in a greasy yellow rag. I turned back to the box. The scratching stopped.
"Jax, don't!"
Leo pleaded, but the 3rd latch, the one the man told me not to touch, was already vibrating. Something inside was pushing against it. I reached out, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My fingers felt like ice as I gripped the cold steel toggle. I flipped it. The lid didn't fly open. It hissed, a long, slow release of pressure that smelled like a basement that hadn't been opened in 50 years. The lid creaked up and through the narrow gap. I didn't see a pizza. I saw a row of Polaroid photos taped to the inside of the lid. All of them were of me. Me sleeping in my bed. Me riding my bike to school. Me sitting right here at this table 3 minutes ago. But under the photos, resting in a bed of ice and blood, was my father's wallet. It was soaked through, the leather swollen and dark, and tucked into the billfold, where his driver's license should have been, was a folded piece of notebook paper. I pulled it out, my fingers slick with the red mess. It was my father's handwriting, jagged and rushed. It only said 4 words. He found the key. Outside, the car door slammed. I looked up and saw the man walking back toward the porch. He wasn't smiling anymore. He had the yellow rag unwrapped, and in his hand, he was carrying my father's heavy, silver-plated revolvers. He didn't knock this time. He just kicked the door, and the wood splintered like matchsticks. The sound of the door frame shattering was like a gunshot in that small hallway. Leo screamed, a short, sharp sound that was cut off by sheer terror, and scrambled backward, tripping over a kitchen chair. The man in the gray windbreaker stepped into the house. He didn't rush. He moved with a terrifying, calculated stillness. The revolver in his right hand looked heavy, but he held it with the ease of someone who had practiced the weight of it 1,000 times. He looked at the box, then at my blood-stained hands. Then finally, he locked eyes with me.
You couldn't wait,
He said, his voice dropping to a low, disappointed hum.
Your father always said you were the curious one. It's a dangerous trait, Jax. It's what got him into trouble.
He raised the gun, but he didn't point it at me. He pointed it at the ceiling. "Do you hear that, Frank?" he shouted to the empty house. The boy opened the gift. He's seen the wallet. "Are you going to come out now? Or do I have to start taking things apart, piece by piece?" Silence followed. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of the red liquid hitting the floor from the edge of the table. My father didn't answer. He wasn't in the living room, and he wasn't in the kitchen. The man leaned in closer to me, his gold-rimmed glasses sliding down the bridge of his sweaty nose. "The key wasn't in the wallet, was it?" he whispered, almost gently. "He gave it to you, didn't he? The key to the safety deposit box? The one with the documents he stole from the firm?" I didn't know what he was talking about. I was 13. I didn't know about firms or documents. I only knew that my father's wallet was sitting in a pool of blood, and this man was standing in my house with a gun.
I don't have a key, I managed to choke out, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else.
The man's face twisted. The calm suburban mask finally slipped, revealing a raw, jagged edge of desperation underneath. He grabbed the edge of the matte black box and flipped it completely over. The contents spilled out across the white lace, and my stomach did a slow, sickening roll. It wasn't just a wallet and photos. Something else slid out of a hidden compartment in the bottom. It was a heavy, brass skeleton key, wrapped in a lock of hair that was the exact same shade as my mother's.
Liar!
The man hissed, his thumb pulling back the hammer of the revolver with a crisp, terrifying click. Outside in the driveway, the black sedan's engine suddenly roared to life, the tires screaming as it began to move toward the house. Unsteered, like it was being pulled by an invisible wire. The roar of that engine felt like it was coming from inside my own chest. I watched through the window as the sedan jumped the curb, the black bumper crushing my mother's prize-winning hydrangeas, until the grill of the car was inches from the porch steps. The headlights finally flickered on, two blinding, surgical white beams that flooded the dining room, casting the man's shadow long and jagged across the wall. He didn't even flinch at the noise. He just stared at the brass key lying in the gore, his eyes wide and hungry.
There it is,
he whispered, reaching out a trembling hand.
The legacy. All that blood for a piece of hardware.
But as his fingers closed around the key, a heavy metallic thud came from the ceiling directly above us. Then another. It sounded like someone was dragging a heavy trunk across the attic floor. The man froze. He looked up, the revolver shaking in his grip. "Frank," he called out, his voice cracking. "I know you're up there. I have the boy. I have the key." A floorboard groaned, and then a slow, rhythmic tapping started. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the air vent in the corner of the room. Leo was curled in a ball under the kitchen table, sobbing silently. I looked at the vent, and then back at the man. I realized then that he wasn't just evil. He was terrified. He was looking at the ceiling like he expected the house itself to swallow him whole.
You think he's coming to save you?
The man hissed at me, his teeth bared in a jagged yellow snarl. "Your father didn't go into hiding to protect you. He went into hiding to protect this." He lunged across the table, grabbing me by the collar of my t-shirt. He pressed the cold, oily barrel of the revolver against my temple. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the smell of that industrial cleaner filling my lungs until I wanted to gag.
Call him,
he screamed.
Tell him if he doesn't come down here right now. I'm going to show you exactly what's inside the second box in the car.
I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out, because at that exact moment, the front door didn't just open. It was ripped off its hinges from the outside. The man spun around, dragging me with him as a human shield. Standing in the blinding glare of the sedan's headlights was a figure. It wasn't my father. It was another man, identical to the one holding me. Same gray windbreaker, same gold-rimmed glasses, same waxy yellow skin. The man holding me gasped, his grip loosening just a fraction. "No," he breathed. "I finished you. I put you in the box." The man in the doorway didn't say a word. He just held up a matte black pizza box, identical to the one on our table, and began to unlatch the first hook. The silence that followed was louder than the engine. The man holding me was hyperventilating now, the revolver barrel knocking against my skull in a frantic, uneven rhythm. I looked from the man in the room to the man in the doorway. My brain felt like it was short-circuiting. They weren't just similar, they were exact. Every wrinkle, every sweat stain. Even the way the light glinted off those gold-rimmed frames.
You're not real.
The man holding me whimpered, his voice rising to a panicked shriek.
I delivered you. I drove the car. I did the job.
The twin in the doorway didn't blink. He reached for the second latch. Click. The sound echoed through the house like a bone breaking. Leo let out a choked, ragged sob from under the table, crawling further into the shadows. I watched the man in the doorway's hands. They were steady, precise, moving with a cold, mechanical grace that made the man holding me look like a crumbling wreck.
Stop it!
My captor screamed, swinging the gun away from my head and pointing it at the door.
I'll kill him. I'll kill the boy and the legacy. I'll burn this whole town to the ground.
The man in the doorway stopped. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in those eyes. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. Like he was looking at a piece of furniture he'd owned a long time ago. He reached for the third latch, the one I had been told never to touch.
Don't!
The man holding me roared. He pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the small dining room. The muzzle flash turned the world white for a split second, and the smell of gunpowder instantly replaced the peppermint and rot. But the man in the doorway didn't fall. The bullet hit the matte black box he was holding, leaving a jagged, smoking hole in the polymer. Instead of wood splintering or metal sparking, a thick, black vapor began to hiss out of the bullet hole. It didn't rise. It fell, heavy and dark, crawling across the floor toward us like a living thing. The man in the doorway finally spoke. His voice was a perfect, haunting echo of the man holding me. "You always were a bad shot, Frank." He flipped the third latch. The lid of the second box swung open, and the heavy, rhythmic scratching from our table was suddenly answered by a sound from the doorway. It was the sound of 100 tiny, wet footsteps. The sound was like 1,000 dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk, but heavier, more purposeful. From the darkness of the second box, dozens of small, pale objects began to spill out, tumbling over the threshold and into the light of the foyer. They were keys, thousands of them, brass, silver, iron, and plastic. They flowed across the floor in a metallic wave, clinking and clattering as they surged toward the man holding me. He began to back away, dragging me with him, his boots crunching and sliding on the sea of jagged metal.
Get away from me,
he screamed, firing the revolver again and again into the pile of keys. But you can't kill metal. The bullets just ricocheted off the floor, shattering the china cabinet and sending shards of glass raining down on us, like winter ice. The man in the doorway stepped over the wave of keys, his eyes fixed on the matte black box on our dining room table. He wasn't looking at me. He wasn't looking at his double. He was looking at the box that was still leaking that thick, dark fluid.
"You didn't deliver the pizza, Frank,"
the man in the doorway said, his voice calm, almost academic.
"You delivered the evidence."
The man holding me, the one he called Frank, stumbled. His heel caught on the edge of the rug, and we both went down. I hit the floor hard, the taste of copper filling my mouth as my chin slammed into the hardwood. I scrambled away, crawling toward the kitchen, toward where Leo was hiding. I looked back and saw the two men standing over the table. They looked like a mirror image reflecting a nightmare. The Frank who had held me hostage was on his knees now, the revolver empty, clicking uselessly as he pulled the trigger over and over. The other man reached down and picked up the matte black box from the table. He didn't use the latches. He put his hands on either side of the lid and, with a slow, sickening grunt of effort, he began to peel the polymer apart. The sound was like wet leather tearing. The smell that erupted from the box made me lose the little bit of lunch I'd left in my stomach. It wasn't just old copper anymore. It was the smell of a locker room, a hospital, and a butcher shop all rolled into one. As the lid gave way, the scratching from inside reached a fever pitch. A hand reached out. It was a human hand, small, pale, and wearing a friendship bracelet made of blue and yellow thread. My heart stopped. I knew that bracelet. I'd helped Leo tie the knots on it 3 days ago at the quarry. I turned to look under the kitchen table, to where Leo had been crouching. The space was empty. Only a single silver-plated revolver lay on the floor where my friend had been. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The air in the kitchen felt like it had been replaced with freezing lead. I stared at the empty space where Leo had been, my mind trying to reconcile the impossibility of it. The bracelet, our blue and yellow friendship bracelet, wasn't just lying on the floor. It was tangled around a finger, emerging from the dark, gelatinous interior of the box. The man in the doorway, the one who called himself the original, turned his head slowly toward me. He didn't look at Frank, who was now curled in a fetal position amidst the mountain of clattering keys. He looked at me with that same hollow, polite expression.
"You're wondering where the boy went, Jax,"
he said, his voice as smooth as polished glass.
"He didn't go anywhere. He's just being processed."
Frank let out a high-pitched, wet laugh, his body convulsing on the floor.
"He's not a boy anymore, is he? Not after the box, not after the contents."
The hand reaching out of the black container gripped the edge of the dining room table. It was followed by another, and then the top of a head began to rise. It wasn't Leo. The hair was the right color, but the texture was wrong. It looked like wet, matted straw. The skin was translucent, stretched over a skull that seemed to be rearranging itself in real time, the jaw clicking and sliding as it found its alignment. The man holding the box moved toward me, the heavy, oily smell of that black liquid trailing behind him like a shroud. He stopped at the threshold of the kitchen, blocking my only exit.
"Your father left a ledger, Jax,"
he said, stepping over the threshold. The floorboards didn't just creak. They groaned under his weight, as if he were carrying something impossibly heavy.
"He thought he could hide it in the safety deposit box. He thought he could bury it in the records of the Clarksville plant. But every secret leaves a trail, and every trail leads back to the box."
He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver Polaroid camera, the same one that had been in the box on the porch. He aimed the lens directly at me.
"Smile, Jax,"
he whispered.
"We need a new cover for the records. Something fresh. Something that remembers the summer of '98.
The flash didn't just blind me, it felt like a surgical strike. The world turned into a negative image. white light burning into my retinas, and for a split second I saw the house not as it was, but as it looked from the inside of the box. I saw the cellar door, the one my father had told me never to touch, standing wide open, spilling out a darkness that seemed to be drinking the very air out of the room. And from that darkness, I heard the sound of my father's voice. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a plea. It was a rhythmic, mechanical tapping. Tap, tap, tap. The same sequence he used to use to call me for dinner. The man holding the cameras stepped forward, the floor shaking with every stride.
"Don't worry,"
he said, his voice drifting further and further away as the edges of my vision turned to charcoal.
"You aren't disappearing. You're just being filed away."
I felt a cold, metallic hand clamp onto my shoulder. It felt exactly like a leather glove, hard and unyielding.
"Now,"
he said, the whisper vibrating against my ear.
"let's see what's in the cellar."
The air in the house had gone completely still. It was that kind of heavy, pressurized silence that makes your ears ring. The man holding me, Frank, was still shaking, his knuckles white as he gripped my shoulder. But his focus had shifted entirely to the figure in the doorway.
"You're not him,"
Frank rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on concrete.
"You're just another copy, another file in the stack."
The man in the doorway didn't respond with words. He simply shifted his weight, his eyes, pale, clinical, and utterly devoid of warmth, tracing the room. He seemed to be cataloging the mess. The spilled red liquid, the shattered china, the terrified boy pressed against the wall. When his gaze finally landed on me, it felt like being pinned to a board by a needle.
"The boy is compromised, Frank,"
the man in the doorway said. His voice was a perfect, chilling match to the one I'd been listening to all evening, yet it carried an authority that made the air feel thinner.
"He's seen the contents. He's touched the key. We don't file compromised assets. We incinerate them."
Frank's grip on my shirt tightened so hard I felt the fabric tear. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of something in his eyes that wasn't madness. It was fear. He wasn't afraid of the man in the doorway. He was afraid of what that man was going to do to us.
"We can't,"
Frank whispered, his voice trembling.
"The father. He hid the ledger in the cellar. If we incinerate the house, we lose the coordinates. We lose everything."
The man in the doorway took one step into the foyer. The floorboards didn't just creak. They groaned, and I noticed, with a jolt of horror, that where he stepped, the dust on the floor seemed to turn gray and brittle, as if the very life was being sucked out of the wood.
"The father is irrelevant,"
the man replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass object. Not a key, but a heavy circular dial, like the combination lock of a high-security vault. He held it up, and the room began to hum. It was a low-frequency vibration, the same sound I'd heard from the black sedan, but magnified 100 times. It rattled my teeth and my gums.
"Frank, step away from the boy,"
he commanded. Frank didn't move. He kept the revolver trained on the man in the doorway, but he was backed into a corner now, the pile of keys from the first box clattering beneath his boots like a mountain of teeth.
"I won't let you."
Frank shouted, his voice cracking.
"I've spent years maintaining this route. I've fed the boxes. I've kept the records clean. I earned the right to see the ledger."
The man in the doorway sighed, a slow, patient sound that felt more terrifying than any scream. He tilted his head, and in the harsh glare of the sedan's headlights, I saw something that turned my blood to ice. Behind his right ear, where the skin should have been smooth, there was a cyme, a thin, perfectly straight line of silver stitches, holding the skin of his face to the frame beneath.
"You haven't been maintaining anything, Frank,"
the man said softly. He began to turn the brass dial in his hand. Click, click, click. As he turned it, the air in the room began to fold. Not like paper, but like reality itself. The corners of the ceiling seemed to stretch toward the center of the room. and the shadows on the walls detached themselves, creeping toward us like ink spilled on a map.
"You're just another prototype that failed to calibrate,"
He added.
"and it's time for a recall."
The room wasn't just shaking, it was deforming. The walls began to lean inward at impossible angles, and the light from the sedan's headlights outside didn't just illuminate the room, it seemed to be scrubbing the color right out of the floorboards. Frank let out a high-pitched, manic laugh, his knuckles white as he pressed the barrel of the revolver against my temple. "A recall? You don't have the clearance. The ledger belongs to the source, and I'm the one who knows where the foundation is buried." The man in the doorway, the one with the silver stitching, took another step forward. His movements were rhythmic, jerky, like a clockwork mechanism being wound too tight. "You're a glitch, Frank. A messy, sentimental, error-ridden glitch." He continued to turn the brass dial in his palm. Click, click, click. With every click, the air pressure in the house dropped. I could feel my ears popping, the sound of the house groaning as the structural beams began to warp. A portrait of my mother hanging in the hallway tore itself from the wall, not falling but literally unraveling into hundreds of thin black strips of paper that swirled into the air like a vortex.
"Jax,
Frank hissed, his breath hot and ragged against my ear.
listen to me. When the floor opens, jump. Don't look at the cellar. Look at the foundation. Underneath the house, there's a tunnel. That's how he keeps the supply line open." "Frank, be quiet,"
The man in the doorway whispered, his voice suddenly sounding like it was coming from everywhere at once. The ceiling, the floor, the very walls of the house. He didn't just turn the dial anymore. He crushed it. A sound like a massive rusted gear grinding against steel exploded through the room. The hardwood floor beneath our feet shattered, but it didn't fall into the cellar. It vanished. In its place was a swirling vertical shaft of absolute, light-consuming darkness. Frank let out a strangled cry as his boots lost their purchase. He gripped my collar, pulling me down with him, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the man in the doorway with a look of pure, unadulterated awe.
"The source."
Frank whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and reverence.
It's not a ledger."
As we plummeted into the dark, I saw the man in the doorway reach into the air where the wall had been. He didn't grab a handle. He grabbed the space itself, peeling back the fabric of the room like a layer of skin, to reveal what was behind it. It wasn't a tunnel. It was a factory. Stretching out into an impossible subterranean distance were thousands of identical black pizza boxes moving along a conveyor belt made of bone and wire, and standing over the assembly line, packing them with photos, keys, and bits of human memory, were thousands of versions of Frank. They all stopped their work at once, turned their heads in perfect, synchronized motion, and looked up at the hole in the floor, where we had fallen.
"Maintenance."
The man in the doorway said, his voice echoing from the factory floor below.
"Report to the cutting room."
I wasn't falling anymore. I was hanging in the air, suspended by the sheer mechanical hum of the world beneath my childhood home. And then, the man in the doorway, the source, leaned over the edge of the hole, his silver-stitched face inches from mine, and dropped something into my open palm. It was a slice of cold, greasy pepperoni pizza. But as I looked at the pepperoni, I realized each slice was a tiny, perfectly preserved Polaroid of my own eyes.
"Eat,"
He commanded.
"We need your vision for the next batch."
I couldn't breathe. The slice of pizza in my hand felt impossibly heavy, vibrating with that same subsonic hum that had started this entire nightmare. I looked down at the pepperoni. Each circular topping was a perfectly clear, high-contrast Polaroid of my own right eye, staring back at me from the grease.
"I said eat."
The source repeated, his voice dropping into a register that felt like grinding stones. Below us, a conveyor belt of bone and wire groaned into motion. Thousands of Frank copies stopped their rhythmic work and began to chant. a low, discordant drone that sounded like 1,000 telephone lines crossed at once. Frank, who was still clinging to my shirt as we dangled over the abyss, started to weep. It wasn't the weeping of a man about to die. It was the hollow, rhythmic sobbing of a machine that had finally realized its own obsolescence.
He's going to restart the loop,
Frank whispered, his eyes wide and vacant as he looked down at the assembly line.
He needs fresh data, Jax. The summer of '98, it's corrupted. The photos are fading. The memories are fraying at the edges. He needs to re-record the trauma.
Before I could react, the source reached down and snatched the pizza slice from my hand. He didn't eat it. He pressed it against the seam of silver stitches near his ear. As the grease and the film-based images soaked into the wound, the stitches began to glow with a sickly, iridescent light. The room, or the factory, or whatever hell I was suspended in, began to twist. Suddenly, I wasn't dangling over the abyss anymore. I was back on my porch. It was July of '98. The sun was setting, painting the Indiana sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. My bicycle was leaning against the railing, the chain still caked in mud from the cornfields. But it was wrong. The cornfields weren't swaying. They were static, painted backdrops that ended abruptly at the edge of the property line. And Leo was sitting on the porch swing, but he was staring at a blank wall, his hands moving in a constant, twitching motion as if he were trying to fold an invisible piece of paper. "Leo," I whispered. He didn't turn. He just kept folding. Crease, press, fold. I looked down at the porch floor. The matte black pizza box was sitting there exactly where it had been the first time, but this time it was already open. And inside, instead of photos or keys, was a small, glowing dial. The source stood behind me. I could feel his presence like a cold wind on my neck, even though I couldn't hear him move. "You have one chance, Jax," he whispered, his voice now sounding exactly like my father's, a voice I hadn't heard in years. "If you turn the dial to the left, you go back to before you ordered the pizza. You live your life, you grow old, and you forget this ever happened. But your father, the real one, he stays in the factory. He becomes the memory that keeps the conveyor belt moving." He leaned in, his breath smelling of ozone and old stagnant water. "But if you turn it to the right, you become the delivery driver. You take the car, you take the box. You go back to that morning in July, and you pick up the 13-year-old version of yourself. You ensure the loop remains unbroken." He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip freezing. "Choose, Jax. The pizza is getting cold." I stood frozen in the amber twilight of that summer evening, the smell of damp earth and blooming corn hanging heavy in the air. It was so real I could almost taste the cherry soda I'd been drinking before the world shattered. But the porch swing kept creaking, a rhythmic hollow sound that didn't match the wind. Leo stopped his folding. He didn't look at me, but his fingers, stained with ink and something dark, began to trace shapes on the wood of the swing. He was drawing the same thing over and over, a sedan with no wheels, floating over a landscape of jagged lines.
He's watching! Jax!
Leo whispered, his voice stripped of all emotion, sounding like a recording played at the wrong speed.
He's watching to see if you have the stomach for it.
The source stood just behind me, a looming shadow that seemed to pull the light out of the porch. I looked down at the glowing dial in the open box. It was warm, unnervingly warm, pulsing with a soft, rhythmic throb. It looked less like a machine and more like a biological organ, twitching under the pressure of my gaze. I felt a sudden sharp ache in my chest. I looked down and saw my own shirt, the blue t-shirt I'd been wearing that day, beginning to fray. The fabric was turning into thin, papery strips, drifting away into the twilight like ash from a fire. I was being edited. My history was being deleted, one thread at a time. "You're running out of time, Jax," the source said, his voice now a chorus of 100 different tones. My mother's gentle lilt, my father's stern lecture, and the cold mechanical hum of the factory floor. Look at the dial. Look closely. I leaned in, my vision blurring. Engraved on the brass face of the dial weren't numbers or directions. They were images. To the left, the path of forgetting, was a tiny, intricate engraving of a cemetery. I saw myself 50 years from now, standing before a headstone that had no name. I saw the life I would lead, a suburban house, a quiet job, a constant nagging feeling of wrongness. Whenever I saw a black car or smelled oregano, I saw the empty, hollow core where my true memories used to be, filled in with fake stories and manufactured happiness. To the right, the path of the driver was an engraving of a mirror. In the reflection, I saw myself, but my face was shifting. I saw the waxy skin, the gold-rimmed glasses, the sharp, angular skull. I saw myself pulling up to a house, handing a box to a kid who looked exactly like I did at 13, and whispering the same words that had doomed me. "That's not a choice," I shouted, my voice cracking. "That's a prison."
"It's a franchise,"
the source corrected. He reached out and tapped the dial. Suddenly, the porch vanished. We were back in the factory, suspended over the assembly line. But the conveyor belt had stopped. All those thousands of frank copies were staring up at us, their mouths hanging open, revealing that they were filled not with tongues, but with rolled-up strips of film, the collective, stolen memories of everyone they had ever processed.
"The ledger isn't in the cellar, Jax,"
the source said, and for the first time, he sounded almost regretful. "The ledger is the boy. You were never the victim. You were the storage unit. Your father didn't hide the documents. He hid you inside the loop to keep the data from being indexed." He pointed to the conveyor belt, where a new empty black box was sliding toward me.
"Step into the box, Jax, or I'll have the versions of you from the other timelines push you in."
Behind me, the shadows began to solidify. I turned and saw them, dozens of Jacks from different cycles. Some were old and broken. Some were still 13. All of them had the same hollow, terror-filled eyes. They were closing in, their hands outstretched, their fingers twitching with the urge to fold me away. The Jacks from the other timelines didn't speak. They didn't even breathe. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying fluidity. Their hands, each one wearing that same blue and yellow thread friendship bracelet, reaching toward me like a closing cage. I backed away until my heels hung over the edge of the abyss, the conveyor belt of bone and wire humming beneath me like a hive of hornets. I looked at the source, that thing with the silver-stitched face, and realized he wasn't waiting for me to choose a path anymore. He was waiting for me to break. "You want the ledger," I whispered, my voice sounding thin against the backdrop of 1,000 ticking clocks.
"I want the data, Jax,"
The source corrected.
"The ledger is just a set of instructions. You are the storage medium. Every time you were scared, every time you felt that summer heat, every time you looked at a black sedan and felt your blood turn to ice, that was you indexing the trauma. You are the most efficient archive I've ever built."
I looked down at the empty black box sliding toward me on the belt. Inside, it wasn't empty. It was lined with tiny, microscopic mirrors. "If I step into that box," I said, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, "I become part of the loop. I become the one who drives the sedan." The source tilted his head, the silver stitches pulling tight against his translucent skin.
"You already are the driver, Jax. You just haven't looked in the rearview mirror yet."
He gestured to the surrounding abyss. Slowly, the dark walls began to clarify. I saw that the factory walls weren't brick or metal. They were wallpaper. My bedroom wallpaper, the same faded floral pattern from 1998. The conveyor belt wasn't made of bone. It was the wood paneling of our hallway. The entire factory was just the floor plan of my childhood home, stretched, distorted, and folded into an infinite recursive loop.
Your father didn't hide you in a cellar.
The source said, his voice dropping to that intimate, stage whisper register that made my skin crawl.
He folded the house around you. He turned your entire life into a recursive file, a safe space where the data could remain encrypted until the recall.
I felt a sudden sharp tug on my wrist. I looked down. One of the jacks, a version of me with gray thinning hair and empty sockets, had grabbed my arm. His grip was cold, like wet clay. "Don't let him ride over you," the old version of me hissed, his voice sounding like a rusted gate. "He doesn't want the ledger. He wants the key, the one you're still holding." I blinked. My hand, which I had clenched into a white-knuckled fist, slowly opened. Resting in my palm was the brass skeleton key from the table, but it wasn't brass anymore. It was turning into a key-shaped shadow, pulsating with a light that seemed to be coming from outside the house, from the real world. The source's expression shifted. The polite academic mask dropped, replaced by a jagged, hungry snarl.
"Give me the override, Jax. You don't know what you're holding."
"I think I do," I said, my voice growing steadier as I looked at the key. I didn't turn it to the left. I didn't turn it to the right. I jammed the key into the air itself, right into the seam of reality where the wallpaper met the factory wall. The sound wasn't a crack or a thud. It was the sound of a telephone line being ripped out of the wall. Static. A deafening total white noise roar that swallowed the factory, the belt, the clones, and the source's scream. Everything went silent. I felt myself falling, but not into the abyss. I felt myself falling upward. The white noise roar didn't stop. It peaked, a high-frequency shriek that shattered the walls of the reality I had been folded into. The factory, the conveyor belt, the endless rows of boxes, it all peeled away like scorched paint. I wasn't in the house. I wasn't in a cellar. I was standing in the middle of a Clarksville intersection. It was night, the air was cool, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic ticking of a traffic light. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but they were mine. No friendship bracelet, no waxen skin, just the grease-stained palms of a man who had seen too much. In my right hand, the brass key was gone, replaced by a jagged, sharp-edged piece of charred plastic, the remains of a Polaroid photo. I looked at it under the flickering street lamp. It was a picture of me, standing on that porch in July of '98, looking directly at the camera with a face full of unadulterated terror. But I wasn't alone. Behind me, in the shadows of the doorway, sat a man in a gray windbreaker, his face blurred into a smear of static. I looked up, and there it was, parked at the curb, half hidden by the overgrown weeds of a vacant lot, was a late-model black sedan. It was covered in decades of dust and rust, its tires long since rotted into the asphalt. It looked like it had been sitting there since 1998. I walked toward it, my boots heavy on the cracked concrete. The driver's side door hung open, creaking in the wind. I reached in, my heart hammering against my ribs, and brushed the dust off the dashboard. There, sitting in the ignition, was a small silver-plated key. I didn't take it, I didn't touch it. Instead, I leaned in and looked at the rearview mirror. It was cracked down the middle, reflecting a distorted, fractured version of the street behind me. And for a fleeting, terrifying moment, I saw a 13-year-old boy sitting in the passenger seat, his eyes wide, his hands trembling as he reached for a black box. I pulled back, the air suddenly tasting of peppermint and formaldehyde. I realized then that the loop hadn't been broken. It had been exported. I turned around and started walking, not toward home, but toward the interstate. I didn't look back when the black sedan's engine suddenly sputtered to life behind me, a low mechanical growl that echoed through the empty streets of Clarksville. I didn't look back when the headlights flickered on, surgical and bright, illuminating the path ahead of me. I just kept walking, because I knew, deep down in the marrow of my bones, that somewhere in this town, a 13-year-old kid was just finishing his dinner. And the phone was about to ring. I am free. But the driver has a job to do. And as I stepped into the shadows of the cornfields, leaving Clarksville behind forever, I heard the faint, distant sound of a doorbell ringing. Ding dong. The delivery had arrived.